first holiday I ever had on my own, not alone, but I was 17 when I went away without my parents. I went off with my friend Stephen, and we hired a small caravan, and I went off on my 100cc motorbike, which is not a big motorbike, and we headed off to the Northampton coast of Northern Ireland to a rain-soaked Portrush for a week. Does anybody know Portrush or know what it's like? Well, it's not as classy as Blackpool. It's probably even more run down than Blackpool, even then. I would say Portrush in the height of summer is like Blackpool in the height of winter. But because of the weather, we were stuck in virtually the whole week. Trapped in a little tiny caravan, 17 and 18 years old. But we brought a travel chess set with us, so we decided we'd have a mini chess tournament. However, we did argue and contest the environment in which these matches should be played. My friend Stephen, he ruled that the radio should be on and loud rock music should be playing in the background while we were playing chess. And I wanted the rule to be there would be no background music so that I could concentrate on the game. So in the end, Stephen, who was my older and wiser, decided that he would stick to his rule and I could stick to mine. So that was just one of many sources of conflict that we had that week. And to be in all honesty, it was not really a great holiday. It was pretty miserable. And we were both rather immature at the time, and we didn't really want to compromise on anything. And it was a relief, really, to get home. And I didn't go away on a holiday with a friend for a couple of years after that. We had a lot of quarrelling and bickering that week. And it really seemed to that neither of us wanted to give up what we felt was our right. The question this morning is how, as Christians, how as human beings, can we prevent or avoid experiencing conflict? Now, if I could show you a scripture, or that would show you a way that you could reduce conflict in your life, would you be interested? I hope you might be. But also more than that, it would not only maybe teach you to reduce conflict, but you may find that through times of hardship, you can be blessed. And that, I believe, is really worth mining and discovering. The story that was read for us this morning, in a sense, falls into three parts. The first part is the first 7 verses, and in these verses we're introduced to the conflict that is playing out in the chapter. Verses 1 to 4, I'll just put them up and you can reread them if you want, as they sit behind me. These opening verses show us that Abram was rich in livestock, but also it notes that he was also wealthy in silver and gold, and that he goes to Bethel to build an altar there. And it also draws attention to the fact that he had Lot with him. Now you may recall God told Abraham a few chapters ago, a few weeks back when we unpacked it, he told him to leave Haran and leave his family. But Lot had gone with him. The fact that Lot went with him is an indication that Abraham wasn't totally obeying the Lord at this point. The other thing that is obvious is that Abraham was rich, not only in livestock, but also, it's really worth noting, that in silver and gold. Now that would have been quite unusual for a nomad or a herdsman to be wealthy in that way. But the fact that he returns to Bethel, where he had previously built an altar, many believe is an indication of his returning, in a sense, to his relationship with the Lord. So these verses are telling us that Abraham, after the failures in Egypt that we talked about last week, he's now returning to Bethel, where he had previously worshipped and called on the Lord and built an altar. And in a sense it means, there's a picture here of him finding his way back nearer to the Lord. Now many preachers have used this passage to talk about, and they'll say, have you wandered away from the Lord? get back to Bethel. That's a good Baptist sermon, Back to Bethel. In fact, there's a very famous one by Spurgeon called Back to Bethel. You've departed from the Lord and you need to get back to Bethel. Have you ever wandered into Egypt? Have you ever wandered off and got into trouble and then come back and find your way back to the Lord? Well, there's a good message there about getting back to Bethel. But that's not what I'm going to particularly draw out of the text this morning. I've got something else I'd like us to look at today. And I don't think I can top Spurgeon, and that sermon's online if you want to go and read it. Remember, Abraham had not been totally obedient in allowing Lot to tag along, but he had in a sense spiritually made a journey back here. And it's important to note that he's gone back to somewhere where he previously built an altar and he praised and called upon the name of the Lord. Have the next verses up, please. But now in verse 5 we get introduced to Lot. Now if you're reading the passage and paying attention, you can't help but notice that we were told a couple of verses ago that Abraham was rich and had livestock, but he also had silver and gold. When it gets to Lot, it tells us that he was also wealthy, and he was wealthy in flocks and herds. So yeah, he was rich in the traditional way, but not quite in the same way as Abraham was. Abraham had possessions, but I would suggest to you, in spite of his mistakes, in spite of the possessions he had, those possessions, in returning to where his altar was, where he would make a sacrifice, he maybe had possessions, but they didn't really quite have a hold on him in the same way as Lot. Lot had possessions, but his possessions had a hold of him. Perhaps they were even controlling him. Some have said Abraham was rich and spiritual, Lot was rich but carnal. And that sets up verse 6. It should be in front of you, verse 6, which says, "But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together." Now, I've worked in a number of organizations in my life, and I've been in companies, and I thought, you know what? This company isn't big enough for these two people, not for the two egos in this. But I have to be honest and say, I wonder if that attitude sometimes also prevails in the church. In this case, it's simply saying there wasn't enough pasture to feed the flocks and the herds of both these men. That was a practicality that they faced. They both had such large herds that the land wasn't able to feed both this accumulated wealth of animals and livestock that they had. So what we have now is the fact that their increase in wealth, the increase in wealth is the thing that is causing the strife between them. And in times where riches were measured in herds and flocks, they're really arguing about how they're going to hold on to and continue to accumulate wealth. Verse 7 says, "There was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock." I'm just going to pause for a second and ask you a question. Who do you think should have won this argument? Let me ask that question another way. Who had the right to the land? God gave it to Abram. So in a sense, that could have settled the matter right away. Abraham could have said, "Lot, God gave it to me. I'm the owner, and I will make the choice." But interestingly, that's not what he did. What's going on here? True, it's as old as the Old Testament, but friends, it's as new as the newspaper that you read today. And as you'll see at the end of the message, I'm going to close by playing a short video. It is really as new as this week's news. So the question is, what should we do and what did he do to address this sort of problem? And I would like to suggest that the next part of the passage is going to tell us exactly what we should do. I'm going to read this section for us again. It's 8 through verse 13. "So Abraham said to Lot," because it may be too small for you to see, "Let's not have any quarreling between you or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar, and he saw that it was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent near, or as the King James says, towards Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now those first 7 verses that we read, you could summarize them with one word, which is strife. This 8 verses 13, I think the word that covers this is separation. The way they solved their particular problem is they simply separated from each other. But what's very important, and is probably counterintuitive to what you would think he should have done, Abraham says to Lot, you choose. If I go to the right, if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. I'm going to give you the first choice. I wonder if we really understand how significant that is and how important that is. This is a perfect example of someone giving up their rights. This is a word I don't think you're allowed to use this week, but this is a word of someone surrendering their rights. Remember, Lot shouldn't have been with him in the first place. However, Abraham is willing to give up all to prevent the strife and the conflict and the quarrelling increasing. What then Lot does is described for us in a series of verbs. First it says he saw, it says he lifted up his eyes and he saw. He surveyed the land and he said, oh, this is an easy choice. The best land is over there. I'm going to have that. Doesn't matter that it's close to Sodom and Gomorrah and all the temptations that might lie there. Now, someone has suggested that what you are determines what you see, and what you see will determine what you do. And the people you hang out with will influence you. And what he sees and what he saw, he thought, that's what's best for me. Verse 10 says he saw, verse 11 says he chose, and verse 12 says he dwelt there. He lived amongst them. So he saw, he chose, and he dwelt there. And that summarizes exactly what Lot does. Lot chose what was best for him. He chose what was most desirable to the eye. And he chose selfishly. So if nothing else, we should learn to choose not by what we see, but by what we know and trust the Lord wants for us. In other words, don't operate on the desires of the flesh, but always, as best you can, on the discernment of God's Spirit and Word, try and follow spiritual principles, not carnal, worldly principles. Someone once wrote, many years ago, Lot did not ask if this was a good place to raise a family. He only asked if it was a good place to raise cattle and increase his wealth. So he pitched his tent facing towards Sodom. So the question I asked at the beginning was, how do we resolve conflict? And I believe the answer is there within this text. Here the answer is, do what Abraham did and offer to give up your rights. Surrender your rights. Want to solve strife, want to end conflict, then be prepared to give up your rights. Now that's a hard word. And I want to be clear that I think this is a biblical principle, not just a one-off illustration from a story. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul chides the church of Corinth because they were having disputes going on in the church. and to solve it, they were taking each other to court and they were quarreling. And Paul gets very upset and he says, "We know you've got people in the church who could solve this. Go discuss it with spiritually minded people and let them decide what happens. Why are you quarreling and arguing in the courts?" And then he says this, 1 Corinthians 6, 7 and 8. "The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers and sisters." And that's brothers and sisters in Christ. This is within the church it's talking about. Quarreling within the church. I think there are situations, in all situations we should always, wherever possible, try and establish peace. Sometimes that means that people have to separate in order to move on with the Lord. You may have to say, "You take the right and I'll take the left" to solve the conflict. Not always, but sometimes. But if everybody in the room, if everybody in the disagreement, if everybody in the quarrel was willing to surrender their rights, if both sides were, then these things would never happen. There would be no one left in the room to argue with. Sometimes it is true. It is better to separate than it is to sit on the sidelines and criticize or let a bitter vine take root. Sometimes, but always, it's better to give up your rights for the sake of peace. Now, some of you maybe don't feel that happy about this word this morning. Can't really tell. Some of you don't look like you're that happy about it, but I can't be sure. Because it is a challenging word, but it is an inspiring word also. You might be thinking, "I'm going to lose out if I do this." You're offering to lose out. It's not a very appealing solution in terms of the world and how we live our lives. So how do you live in the consequences of giving away your rights to the Lord for the sake of God? Well, we have the rest of the story to tell us. Let's pick up at verse 14. "Then the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, 'Look around from where you are in the north and the south, to the east and the west, and the land you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you.' So Abraham went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tent there, and he built an altar to the Lord." It's very straightforward, very simple. The text tells us the next thing that happens is the Lord rewards Abraham for his act of trust. What he then says, he takes out Abraham and says, "Look, I'm going to give you everything that you can see. You gave up your right. I'm now going to bless you beyond your imagination. I'm going to give you everything you can see to the north, the south, and the east, and the west. It's yours." But he's also saying, it's not only yours, it's going to be your descendants. And your descendants are going to be so many, they're going to be beyond counting. Some people have tried to work out the number of grains of sand in a square metre and come up with, this is poetic hyperbole. It's so many, it's beyond counting. So after he's given up what he thought the Lord had given him as his right, the Lord steps in and says, "I'm going to give you even more than you had to give up." So the question changes now. The question changes now, I believe, to what should we give up in order to get what the Lord really wants to give in, pour into our lives? What do we need to give up to receive what the Lord wants to give us? I believe that's the point of this passage. And I'd like to close by making a couple of observations. It's easy to read this passage and simply see quarrelling, separation, resolution, reward. And the passage is definitely talking about those things. But the primary point of the passage is the promise of the land to Abraham, which is mentioned 7 times in this chapter. God promised Abram the land, and Abram was willing to trust the Lord to give it to him. Abraham had reached a point where he'd learned to say, no matter how things look, I am going to trust the Lord. Whatever the future holds, it's in the hand of God, and that is okay with me. It's not a good place to get to in life. So when Abraham trusted the Lord, and he did so unselfishly, to the point where he gave up his rights, God enlarged the promise of the land. And that's because, friends, we cannot outgive the Lord. No matter what you feel you give or give up, you cannot outgive the Lord. The contrast between Lot and Abraham is polar opposites. It's there to see. Lot chose by sight and was selfish. Abraham chose by faith and chose what was spiritual. And by doing so, Abraham was not only rewarded with avoiding strife and conflict in his life, but he inherited great blessings from God. So here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line for every one of us today. Don't ever make winning a quarrel your goal. Don't ever make winning a quarrel your goal. Focus on doing what God wants you to do. Focus on loving God and loving the other person, and God will bless you beyond anything you can give up. And you know what? It's worth it for the peace you will experience in your life, if nothing less. One commentator summed up this situation when he said, Abraham, by giving up his rights to free will, had the freedom to act generously, righteously, mercifully in order to resolve the dispute. I love it. We've been given the free will to be gracious within the promises of God. We have the freedom to be generous, even to the point of surrendering our rights, because we can live by grace in the knowledge that God will always, always, always be gracious to us. That's a wonderful lesson to learn this week. But of course, the greatest example ever of giving up one's rights was Jesus himself. He gave up his rights to a home. He said, the birds have their nests, the foxes have their dens, but I don't have a place to lay my head. He gave up his right for money. He had to borrow a coin to make an illustration, to borrow a coin from someone else. He gave up his right to marriage. He even gave up his right to his reputation. He was the Son of God, and he was called a devil by the religious experts of his day. But he went even further than that. He gave up the right to life itself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. For what purpose did he give up that right? So that God might exalt him and give him a name above every other name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow. But there's another reason he did it. He gave it up to show you how and I how to live our lives. And by doing that, he showed us how to defeat the power of evil and be as an example, bring other people back to God. Jesus was showing us the only way to win is to give up your right and submit yourself to the will of God. Jesus wants us to follow him, and he wants us to follow him by surrendering ourselves to him and not trying to gain the world. Only by taking Jesus' example into every part of your life and surrendering to him will you be able to win. He spells it out for us in Mark chapter 8 when he says this. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. It couldn't be clearer. Let's pray. Father, forgive us that we are so fickle, that we are slow to get the message into trust, and trust in you alone. Teach us to trust you, and teach us and help us to be like your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, and be gracious and generous and surrender to others, so that they might see you and that you can bless us even more. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to close slightly differently this morning. We're not going to have a closing worship song, but I'm going to show you a video, and it's from just Friday. I need to tell you a few names and give you a background, and I think when I've shown it, you'll see it won't feel right just to stand up and sing a happy praise song, but we're going to say the grace to one another, and then we're going to go and have fellowship together. And perhaps if there's a quarrel between people, there's an opportunity to maybe surrender some rights and ask for forgiveness, or just to make a decision that rather than confront someone who's hurt you or offended you, you're just going to pray for them instead. Maybe that's the right thing to do. But I'm going to give you three names so you know what's going on here. Just under a year ago, the three names there's a lady called Amber Geiger, who was a policewoman in America, and there's a young man called Gene Botham. I'm saying the name because Gene Botham is a young man. Now, they both lived in the same block of flats, in identical rooms, and they emerged from the lift. And she lived on the 3rd floor, and he lived on the 4th floor. And she was a policewoman. And she returned from late one evening at 12 o'clock at night, and she accidentally got out of the lift on the 4th floor. And Gene Botham was a young black man. And she turned left out of the lift as normal, and she went into the flat on the 4th floor instead of the 3rd floor. And believing that there was a burglar in her house, she shot Gene Botham dead. Now, this is in the middle of all the Black Lives Matter, and she's a policewoman. And initially the police, kind of as probably are inclined to do, they surrounded and tried to protect her and tried to discredit this young man, but they couldn't. He was in his own bed in his own flat, and he was a youth pastor at the local church, and his life was exemplary. And in the heat of people were calling for her to be executed or to rot in prison, but she was dismissed from the police force because she should not have entered the building, even if she thought it was her own flat. She should have called for backup and to the nearest station, and they should have come. But she did what she did. She went in and she murdered him. She was dismissed from the police and she faced trial, and she was found guilty of murder on Thursday of last week. Well, it was Friday morning for us here. At the trial, Gene Botham's brother, Brent, he was asked to give a witness impact statement after sentencing, just to let her know the impact that the murder of his brother had on his life. And this is what he said.
I don't want to say twice or for the 100th time what or how much you've taken from us. I think you know that. But I hope you go to God with all the guilt, don't think the bad things we have done in the past, each and every one of us may have done something that we're not supposed to do. If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you, and I know if you go to God and ask Him, He will forgive you. And I don't think anyone can say it. Again, I'm speaking for myself, not even God, for my family. But I love you just like anyone else. And I'm not going to say I hope you rot and die just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't going to ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. I'm not going to say anything else. I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that both of them want you to do. Again, I love you as a person. And I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.